The winter flounder is a really interesting species. It was one of the most common species found here in Narragansett Bay and throughout many areas in southern New England and up through the Gulf of Maine. Since about 1980s, the population has declined, and most of that decline was actually due to overfishing. And that was stopped right in the mid-90s.
We've seen the population for winter flounder decline, primarily from the 80s and 90s. We've seen a pretty significant decline for winter flounder, and that's not just within Rhode Island waters in Narragansett Bay. We've seen that pretty pronounced throughout southern New England and the Mid-Atlantic region. So Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, as well as waters in offshore. We've seen this unit, or what we would call stock, of winter flounder declining a lot over the past several years.
And the stocks are doing different in different areas, but here in southern New England, the population has crashed. It has declined quite a bit. There's now, I believe, no fishing on the population, and it's somewhere, I think, below about 10% of what it was from an unfished level. So we're seeing a number of changes. So water temperature is one of the biggest ones, and we see that pretty well. It's easy to measure, and we've got lots of temperature recorders in the water. We have lots of tide gauges out there, lots of people. Just behind me is the Merle Center that's been recording temperature for ages. We've got long-term temperature records that go back to the 50s and even actually go back to the 1900s. So we're seeing the temperature changes quite dramatically. But in addition to that, we're also seeing changes in species turnover, so the way they function in the bay. They're called the winter flounder because they actually swim into Narragansett Bay and many of the other bays in the area during the winter time when it's coldest, and they lay their eggs in the coldest part of the year. And the idea is that they actually use that winter temperature when there are very few other animals in the bay, very few predators, to lay their eggs, and actually there's a kind of a thermal refuge from predation. So they think that instead of hiding their eggs, they can just lay them on the mud, and the larvae can hatch there, but there's very few predators around, and so they can survive well. However, since the bay has started warming, the hypothesis is that the winter flounder are coming in at the same time of year, laying their eggs, hoping that there'll be that same refuge from predation. But as the bay warms, as spring comes earlier and earlier, the predators are coming back earlier and earlier. And so the hypothesis is that many of the eggs and the small fish, the juveniles, the larvae, are actually getting eaten by predators. And so that is one of the challenges of climate change.
We have seen is that the average spawning date that we would estimate from observed larvae has gotten earlier in the year. So when we can see larval presence earlier. I think over the last 40 to 50 years, we might have seen, on average, spawning happening about a week earlier, maybe a week and a half earlier. But I would say, over the last 20 years or 15 years of research on winter flounder, there's been this question about, to what degree, not just the egg stage, but also this, first year of life is effectively a brutal gauntlet for these winter flounder to make through, with various new warmer water species now able to prey on them that may not have been there 30 years ago at the same time anyway.
A few species we see that are starting to move up, black sea bass, which is a very popular angler fish that people like, and so that's good. It's very common throughout the whole mid-Atlantic, even down to South Carolina and Georgia and areas like that. We're starting to see their numbers increase quite a bit. Scup is another species that's commonly found around here. People fish it a lot, they catch a lot. It's a great fish to catch, especially when you're out with your kids, they can catch it. And that one is certainly increased in number down forth. Another fish species we see a lot is actually summer flounder, which has a combination of a recovering population and a warming signal.
Sea bass, we saw very few or no sea bass from basically 1979 up until 2011. And then or 10. And at that point, we saw this almost immediate sharp burst in sea bass. And the benefit is that there is something that's taking its space as opposed to nothing, right? Which would be the more challenging part for an ecosystem in terms of its overall function. So maybe something's ecologically filling the role of winter flounder now, as opposed to that role in the ecosystem gone. I think many of us would still love to see a lot of lobster. We'd love to see a lot of winter flounder, these species that are stressed by temperature. I think a lot of people are also happy to see black sea bass, and they're happy to see scup, particularly those that harvest and make a living or survive off of those species. And so the question really at that point says, what do we as a society want our ecosystem to look like? What are the metrics we want to use to decide whether it's a healthy ecosystem, it's a productive ecosystem, but then also how do we as a community or as managers then allow for us to utilize those species as needed given their explosion within the system.